Millions in the bank cannot buy you a single moment of genuine peace. Vivian learned this the hard way on a damp Tuesday evening, stripped of her luxury convoy and forced onto a crowded city transit. Beside her sat a broken man whose simple utterance would dismantle her entire billionaire reality. Vivian Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office, watching the Chicago rain blur the city lights into streaks of bleeding neon. At 38, she was the sole founder and CEO of Omnicorp Logistics and Holdings, a conglomerate with a net worth hovering around $4.6 billion. She had a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a private jet on standby at O'Hare, and a closet full of bespoke Italian suits. She was also, at this exact moment, completely and utterly trapped. Her phone buzzed relentlessly on the mahogany desk behind her. Each vibration was a nail in the coffin of her career. A hostile takeover was currently underway, orchestrated by her own chief operating officer, Richard Gallagher. Richard had systematically gathered the board of directors behind her back, exploiting a massive PR nightmare involving Omnicorp's newest subsidiary, Apex Medical Solutions. Apex had been ruthless in its cost-cutting measures over the past fiscal year, denying thousands of critical insurance claims to inflate Omnicorp's quarterly profits. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., the board was going to vote to remove her. They were going to strip her of the company she had sacrificed her entire youth, her relationships, and her conscience to build. Vivian, her lawyer, David, had warned her an hour ago over the phone, his voice tight. The press has the leaked Apex files. They know about the denied claims. There are reporters swarming the lobby of your building. If you go down there, they will tear you apart. You need to let Richard take the fall, or you lose everything. But Vivian knew Richard wasn't taking the fall. He had perfectly framed her as the sole architect of the aggressive denial policies. Suffocating in the sterile, climate-controlled air of her office, Vivian grabbed her charcoal Prada trench coat. She bypassed her private elevator, taking the service stairs down to the underground parking garage, intending to slip into a chauffeured Maybach. But the garage was already compromised. Flashes of camera lights bounced off the concrete pillars as a pack of journalists ambushed her driver. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. Vivian turned on her heel and slipped out through the loading dock doors, bursting into the freezing November downpour. She ran. The billionaire CEO, whose face graced the cover of Forbes, sprinted down the flooded alleyway, her designer heels splashing through oily puddles. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to escape the flashing lights, the ringing phones, and the crushing weight of her collapsing empire. 3 blocks away, shivering and soaked to the bone, she saw the glowing marquee of a city bus pulling up to a rusted shelter. Without thinking, Vivian boarded the 22 northbound. She fumbled with a damp $20 bill, something she rarely carried, and shoved it into the fare box, ignoring the driver's grumbled complaint about not having change. She stumbled down the narrow aisle. The bus smelled of wet wool, stale coffee, and exhaust. It was a jarring contrast to the sanitized, lavender-scented air of her usual world. She collapsed into a plastic seat near the back, pulling her wet coat tightly around her trembling shoulders. It was then she realized she wasn't alone in the row. Sitting next to her was a man who looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He wore a faded, navy blue canvas work jacket, frayed at the cuffs. His hands, resting on his lap, were rough and calloused, permanently stained with grease. But it was his face that caught Vivian's attention. He had deep, exhaustion-carved lines around his eyes, yet his expression held a strange, quiet stoicism. Tucked into the crook of his arm, wrapped in a threadbare grey blanket, was a little boy no older than 4. The child was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling softly against the man's chest. In the man's other hand was a stack of mail. The top envelope was a glaring, red-stamped final notice. Vivienne looked away, her own crisis roaring back into her mind. She pulled out her phone. 47 missed calls, 82 urgent messages. The words ruin, bankruptcy, and disgrace jumped out at her from the screen. Her chest tightened. The panic attack she had been fighting off finally hit. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. The walls of the bus seemed to close in. She dropped her phone, burying her face in her hands, desperately trying to quiet the roaring in her ears. She was losing everything. The empire, the prestige, the power. Who was Vivienne Sterling without Omnicorp? She was nobody. Hey, the voice was low, raspy, but incredibly gentle. Vivienne flinched, looking up through damp eyelashes. The man next to her was holding out a clean, neatly folded cotton handkerchief. It was cheap, but perfectly white. "You look like you're drowning, lady," he said, quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping boy. "Take it." Vivienne stared at the offered cloth, then at the man. In her world, no one offered anything without expecting a massive return on investment. Yet, the sincerity in his tired blue eyes broke through her defenses. She took it with a shaking hand. "Thank you." She dabbed her face, the rough cotton feeling surprisingly grounding against her cold skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm losing everything tonight." The man gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, I know the feeling. The rain doesn't help, does it? Makes the bad days feel a little heavier." "It's not just a bad day," Vivienne snapped, the stress making her defensive. "My life's work, gone, taken by people I trusted. Tomorrow morning I wake up with nothing. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed for, it's just gone." The man shifted his weight, adjusting the sleeping toddler. "I'm Arthur," he said softly. "This is Liam." Vivienne hesitated, then gave her first name, omitting her famous surname. "Vivienne." "Well, Vivienne," Arthur said, looking out the rain-streaked window. "I don't know what kind of work you do, but I know a thing or two about losing things." He tapped the stack of mail in his lap. "Got the eviction notice today. Third shift at the auto plant barely covers the groceries, let alone the rent. And it definitely doesn't cover the medical bills." Vivienne's eyes flicked to the papers. Despite her own misery, the raw honesty of this stranger intrigued her. "Medical bills?" Arthur's gaze softened as he looked down at his son. "My wife, Clara. She passed away 8 months ago, ovarian cancer." Vivienne felt a sudden, sharp pang in her chest. "I'm so sorry." "She was a fighter," Arthur continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But the treatments were expensive. We found a clinical trial, a new targeted therapy. Her oncologist swore by it, said it had an 80% chance of pushing her into remission." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But our insurance provider deemed it experimental. They refused to cover it, denied the claim 3 times. By the time I managed to secure a predatory loan to pay for it out of pocket, it was too late. The cancer had spread." Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face. A cold dread, far more terrifying than the hostile takeover, began to pool in her stomach. "Insurance companies," Vivienne managed to choke out. They have strict guidelines." She hated herself as soon as the corporate rhetoric left her mouth. "They have profit margins," Arthur corrected her gently, devoid of anger, which somehow made it worse. "They looked at my wife, the mother of my child, and saw a negative line item on a spreadsheet." He shifted the envelopes in his hand. The bus passed under a bright street lamp, illuminating the top letter. Vivienne stopped breathing. The logo staring back at her from the top of Arthur's debt collection notice was a sleek, minimalist blue mountain peak. Apex Medical Solutions, her company. The very subsidiary she had pressured to trim the fat to boost Omnicorp's stock price. She had personally signed off on the algorithmic software that automatically flagged and denied high-cost experimental treatments. She hadn't looked at the names. She had only looked at the numbers. Clara was one of those numbers. Vivian stared at Arthur, horrified. Sitting inches away from her was the collateral damage of her ambition. This man was working himself to death, facing homelessness, raising a motherless child, all because Vivian Sterling wanted her quarterly earnings report to look attractive to Wall Street. Her vision blurred. The sheer magnitude of her guilt threatened to crush her. "How?" Vivian stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "How do you do it? How do you keep breathing? The world broke you. The system took your wife. It's taking your home. How are you not just consumed by the loss?" Arthur looked at her, really looked at her, and seemed to see right through the expensive designer coat and the manicured facade. "Because I didn't build my life for me," Arthur said simply. He gently stroked his son's hair. "If I had, I would have given up the day Clara died. But I built my life for them, for her, for Liam." He turned his gaze back to Vivian, his eyes piercing through the gloom of the bus. "A fortress built for one is just a waiting tomb," Arthur said, delivering the sentence that would forever sever Vivian's life into a before and an after. "You only truly go bankrupt the day you realize you were the only person you were building the empire for." The words struck Vivian with the force of a physical blow, a waiting tomb. She thought of her massive, empty penthouse. She thought of her bank accounts, her stock portfolios, her ruthless board of directors who would stab her in the back for a fraction of a percent. She had sacrificed love, friendships, and basic human decency to sit at the top of a mountain. And now, she was entirely alone on it. She hadn't built an empire. She had built a mausoleum. The bus hissed to a stop, the doors swinging open into the rainy night. "This is us," Arthur said, carefully standing up so as not to wake Liam. He tucked the terrifying stack of bills into his pocket. "I hope you find your way, Vivian. Whatever it is you think you're losing tonight, maybe it wasn't worth keeping in the first place." He stepped off the bus and disappeared into the dark, wet streets, an umbrella-less man shielding his son from the storm with his own body. Vivian sat paralyzed as the bus lurched forward again. She looked down at the cheap white handkerchief in her hands. The panic over her company was entirely gone. In its place was a burning, furious clarity. Richard Gallagher and the board thought they had outsmarted her. They thought she would quietly resign to save her wealth. They didn't realize that in the span of 30 minutes, Vivian Sterling had just lost her fear of losing her money. She picked up her phone and dialed her lawyer. "David," she said, her voice devoid of its previous panic, replaced by a deadly, frigid calm. "Vivian, where are you?" "The board." "Cancel the settlement negotiations," Vivian interrupted. "Call a press conference for 7 a.m. tomorrow, 1 hour before the board meeting." "A press conference? Vivian, what are you going to do?" Vivian looked out at the city she used to think she owned. "I'm going to burn my own empire to the ground." At 6:15 a.m., the sprawling penthouse that had once been Vivian Sterling's sanctuary felt like a glass cage. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving the Chicago skyline shimmering in the harsh, unforgiving light of dawn. Her attorney, David, was pacing the length of her Persian rug, his face a mottled shade of crimson. "Vivian, this is financial suicide. If you walk into that press room and admit fault, the SEC will be breathing down our necks by noon. The Department of Justice will open an inquiry. You are looking at catastrophic civil liabilities, potential criminal charges, and the absolute eradication of your net worth." Vivian sat at her dining table, ignoring him. Spread out before her were hundreds of pages of printed code and internal communications she had spent the entire night pulling from Omnicorp's encrypted servers. She had found it. The smoking gun. It was internally dubbed Project Chimera, an algorithmic efficiency model implemented by Richard Gallagher, her COO, and fully authorized by her own signature. But as she dug deeper into the metadata, bypassing the sanitized executive summaries she had been spoon-fed over the past year, the horror of what she had built materialized. Chimera wasn't just designed to deny experimental treatments. It was designed to specifically target and delay claims from lower-income zip codes, banking on the statistical probability that those patients lacked the resources to hire lawyers and fight the appeals process. It was a predatory system built on the exhaustion of the vulnerable. And then she found the file. Jenkins, Clara. Patient ID 884-91-A. Vivian stared at the digital footprint of a woman's death. 3 appeals, all automatically rejected within milliseconds of submission by a machine learning model optimizing for quarterly dividends. "David," Vivian said, her voice eerily calm, cutting through his frantic pacing. "Did you know Richard Gallagher owns a 40% shadow stake in Sentinel Recovery?" David stopped dead in his tracks. "The debt collection agency?" "The exact agency Apex Medical Solutions uses to hound the patients we deny coverage to," Vivian confirmed, sliding a printed ledger across the mahogany table. "He denies their life-saving care, forces them into medical debt, and then his secondary shell company buys that debt for pennies on the dollar to harass them into bankruptcy. He's double-dipping in human misery, and I gave him the keys to the kingdom." "My God," David whispered, the color draining from his face. "If this gets out—" "It's getting out in exactly 45 minutes, Vivian said, standing up and smoothing out her charcoal suit. The fear that had paralyzed her in the alleyway was entirely gone. Arthur's words echoed in her mind. "A fortress built for one is just a waiting tomb." By 7 a.m., the Omnicorp lobby was a madhouse. Journalists from the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and local Chicago affiliates were packed shoulder to shoulder, expecting a routine resignation speech. Richard Gallagher stood off to the side, wearing a triumphant, razor-thin smile, surrounded by the board of directors. When Vivian stepped up to the podium, the barrage of camera flashes was blinding. She didn't flinch. She placed a single, thick manila folder on the podium. "Good morning," Vivian began, her voice projecting with absolute authority through the microphone. "I am here to address the leaked documents regarding Apex Medical Solutions, a subsidiary of Omnicorp. The reports you have seen are accurate. In fact, they do not go far enough." A collective gasp rippled through the press corps. Off to the side, Richard's smile instantly vanished. He took a step forward, his eyes darting to the security guards. "For the past 18 months, Omnicorp has prioritized artificial profit inflation over human life," Vivian continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "Under my leadership, we implemented an algorithm, Project Chimera, designed to systematically deny critical care claims to patients based on their socio-economic status." "Vivian, stop!" Richard hissed loudly, stepping into the view of the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Sterling is under immense psychological distress. I am the sole founder and CEO of this company, Richard, and I have the floor," Vivian snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. She opened the folder. "I take full, unmitigated responsibility for the negligence that allowed this to happen. I built a culture of blind ambition." But I will not take the fall for the parasitic corruption that has festered underneath it. She held up a stack of documents. These are the financial records of our Chief Operating Officer, Richard Gallagher. They detail a deliberate scheme to funnel denied patients into a debt collection agency he secretly owns. He hasn't just been padding Omnicorp's margins, he has been personally profiting off the financial ruin and physical suffering of our policyholders. Pandemonium erupted. Reporters shouted over one another, microphones thrusting forward. Security struggled to hold the line. Richard turned ashen, his hands shaking as the board members physically backed away from him, leaving him isolated in the glare of the flashbulbs. As of this moment, I am submitting all internal communications, algorithmic source codes, and financial ledgers to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice, Vivian announced over the roar of the crowd. Furthermore, I am liquidating my entire portfolio of Omnicorp stock, effective immediately. I will use the entirety of my personal fortune to establish a restitution fund for every single patient affected by Project Chimera. She looked directly into the primary news camera, thinking of the tired man on the bus and the sleeping boy in his arms. Omnicorp is fundamentally broken, Vivian declared, her voice resolute, and today I am tearing it down. By 9 a.m., Omnicorp's stock had plummeted by 65%. Trading was halted. By noon, federal agents were walking out of the building with boxes of hard drives, and Richard Gallagher was in handcuffs. Vivian sat alone in her office as the FBI secured the premises. She watched the rain begin to fall against the glass again. She was ruined. She was facing years of litigation. She was no longer a billionaire. And for the first time in a decade, she could breathe, 14 months later. The transition from a Forbes cover billionaire to an ordinary citizen navigating the legal system was brutal. Vivian's penthouse was sold. Her private jets, her art collection, her designer wardrobe, all liquidated to feed the massive restitution trust she had established. She narrowly avoided prison time by cooperating fully with the DOJ, providing the exact mechanisms of Richard's fraud, but the civil fines had stripped her down to a modest, upper-middle-class existence. She now lived in a quiet, two-bedroom apartment in a suburb outside of Chicago. She drove a pre-owned Volvo. She bought her coffee from a corner bodega instead of a private barista. But as the bitter Chicago winter thawed into a tentative spring, Vivian found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She smiled. The Apex Restitution Fund had successfully processed over 12,000 claims. It wasn't just about paying off medical debt. The fund actively covered the experimental treatments that Chimera had previously denied. It was exhausting, unglamorous work, reading file after file, but every approved claim felt like a brick being removed from the tomb she had built around herself. Yet there was one file that had never come across her desk. It took her weeks of hiring private investigators to track him down, because Arthur Jenkins hadn't left a digital footprint since his eviction. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, Vivian pulled her Volvo into the gravel parking lot of a bustling community centre in the working-class neighbourhood of Pilsen. Attached to the centre was a large, newly renovated automotive repair shop. The sign above the bay doors read, "Clara's Garage and Community Transit." Vivian stepped out of her car, the scent of motor oil and hot asphalt hitting her senses. She walked toward the open garage bays. Inside, half a dozen mechanics were working on various vehicles, teaching a group of teenagers how to change brake pads. Standing by a lifted sedan, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag, was Arthur. He looked older, the lines around his eyes a little deeper, but the crushing weight that had stooped his shoulders on that rainy bus was gone. He stood tall, laughing at something one of the teenagers said. Vivian hesitated at the edge of the garage. Suddenly, a small blur of motion rushed past her legs. "Dad! Dad, look!" A 5-year-old boy, practically vibrating with energy, ran up to Arthur, proudly holding up a haphazardly painted wooden birdhouse. It was Liam. He was taller, his cheeks flushed with colour, completely unrecognizable from the fragile, exhausted toddler huddled under a threadbare blanket. Arthur scooped the boy up with one arm, his face breaking into a radiant, genuine smile. "That's a masterpiece, buddy. The birds are going to fight over that one." Vivian felt a lump form in her throat. She took a step forward. Arthur set Liam down and turned, his eyes locked onto Vivian. He froze. The garage around them seemed to quiet down. He slowly wiped his hands again, tossing the rag onto a workbench, and walked out into the sunlight to meet her. He looked her up and down. Gone was the Prada trench coat and the severe, untouchable aura. She wore a simple knit sweater and jeans, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. "I saw the news," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying the same raspy gentleness she remembered. "A lot of news, actually, over the last year." "I took your advice," Vivian said, offering a small, nervous smile. "I realized what I was losing wasn't worth keeping." Arthur nodded slowly, looking back towards the garage. "I got a letter in the mail about 8 months ago. From a trust. They paid off Clara's hospital bills, every single cent. They also sent a check for compensatory damages. It was enough to stop the eviction. Enough to buy this old shop, start a training program for the kids in the neighborhood, and name it after her." He turned his piercing blue eyes back to Vivian. The trust didn't have a name attached, just a P.O. box. "It was the least I could do, Arthur," Vivian said, her voice trembling slightly. "It doesn't bring her back. It doesn't fix the terror I put you through. But I needed you to know. You changed my life. Your wife's memory changed the lives of thousands of people." Arthur was silent for a long time. The distant sounds of city traffic and the clinking of tools in the garage filled the space between them. In her old life, silence was a negotiation tactic. Now, it was just a space for truth. "You burned down your whole world for us," Arthur finally said, a look of profound respect crossing his face. "That takes a different kind of strength." "I was building a tomb," Vivian replied softly. "You handed me the sledgehammer." Arthur reached into the pocket of his denim work shirt. He pulled out a folded, pristine white handkerchief and held it out to her. "You look a lot better today, Vivian," he said, a warm smile finally breaking through. "You don't look like you're drowning anymore." Vivian looked at the handkerchief, tears pricking her eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of panic or despair. She reached out and pushed his hand back gently. "Keep it," she said, looking over his shoulder at Liam, who was enthusiastically explaining his birdhouse to an older mechanic. "I think I've finally learned how to breathe on my own." True wealth is never measured by offshore accounts or the ruthless accumulation of power, but by the tangible impact we leave on the lives of others. Vivian lost an empire, yet in its ashes, she finally reclaimed her humanity. A fortress built solely for oneself will inevitably become a tomb, but a foundation poured for the benefit of many creates an enduring legacy. Sometimes salvation simply requires a bus ticket